Hello, I'm Angela Kane, a communications and marketing consultant for Child Advocates. Child Advocates stands for justice and equity for children and youth every day. It is at the heart of who they are and who they have been for 40 years. In this Zoom Spotlight, we want to share some of the main programs Child Advocates has been offering to serve vulnerable children who face abuse and neglect, and to create a better world for children where their race does not determine their life outcomes. In this video, you'll learn about Child Advocates' race equity program called Interrupting Racism for Children. Joining me are Cindy Booth, Child Advocates CEO, and Jill English, Chief of Community, Equity, and Inclusion for Child Advocates. Always good to have you with us, ladies, and I look forward to having this conversation with you. How are you today?
Good, thank you. Doing well, thank you.
That's good. And Jill, I'm just going to start with you and ask you to tell us more about your department's services, why the race equity program was created, and how you are interrupting racism for children.
Yes, thank you, Angela. Well, our program was created out of a seed that Cindy Booth and Greg Ellis planted about 12 years ago. There was a lot of concern over the inequities of specifically brown and Black children in the child welfare system. 2 to 3 times the child population of African American children being represented. They sought out educational opportunities, recognizing that the children weren't causing the inequities. We've been with Interrupting Racism for Children for the last 4 years, where we work with community on educating in terms of what racism is, how it impacts children, therefore community, because children equal family and families equal community. So every person in our community, in the state of Indiana, everyone's a mandated reporter of abuse and neglect. So the child welfare system is a good litmus test for understanding that all of us have biases that have created an unjust system based on race.
That's so true. And I know that these workshops have had a lot of impact over the years that you've been doing them. Can you tell us specifically, perhaps somebody who attended the workshop and what they said they got out of it? Just a few examples of the impact from those who've attended, success stories or anything along those lines.
Yes, we've actually been getting a lot of emails rolling in recently with one of my staff speaking with participants after the fact, getting a lot of feedback in terms of how people will put forth the educational opportunities that they've gotten, the lessons that they've learned in their positions, also in their communities, and also how they engage with other human beings. So any and everything from an educator who, after attending the workshop, bought skin tone Band-Aids so that when children come up to her desk with a boo-boo, if you want to call it, they get to pick a Band-Aid as opposed to not having equitable representation. Librarians who then focus on having multi-ethnic books, not only multiracial, but also books that represent children with different abilities in their libraries, accessible all year round, just not highlighted in months. I'll give IMPD as an example, who recently we did the new recruits, how they talk about being intentional about understanding the historical context of the neighborhoods that they work in and not taking things personally now that they have more background on the history of neighborhoods, what has happened in those communities, how they've been divested from what we've lost as a result of racism, and how they'll engage with people and continue to educate themselves so they can be better community partners and understanding people beyond their race and beyond the stereotypes.
Wow, there are a lot of lessons they learned through this program. Anything specifically that you wanted to share about somebody who's listening who may want to attend, what they might learn?
Yes. First, I'd like to also say we love working with youth. That is something that from the time I took the role in being in this program, I think we oftentimes do things on behalf of individuals that aren't included. And youth being included in this process and the leadership track that we are taking with some of these youth has been phenomenal, because youth, unlike a lot of adults, don't sit in the workshop and say, what can I do? I don't know what to do. You give them information and they give us energy, because they turn around immediately and tell us what they're going to do with the information. Their minds are so open to the possibilities of what can change just with information, just with context of how we got here today. So youth being in the space have been phenomenal in this way.
That's great, because this is their future and they are our future. So having young people involved has really been, I love hearing some of the reactions I've heard them have, even on social media, about attending these Interrupting Racism for Children workshops. So it really has been rewarding. And Cindy, you helped start lead the charge, I should say, about this race equity program some years ago, at first in the child welfare system alone, then you expanded it into the community. Why do you think this is such critical work today? And why does the whole community need to be engaged in this, do you feel?
Angela, Jill did a great job of explaining why we started,
Hmm.
and the answer to your question is in why we started. We wanted to improve the lives of children that we were involved with in the child welfare system. And once you do that, you realize, I think on two bases, you realize that we are doing this for the children in our community, but we're also doing it for the adults in our community as well. And if we can have conversations that are not divisive, that are not angry, that are not confrontational, and talk about how things have evolved from in Indianapolis, I think then our community is improved and our community begins to talk to each other in a real way.
And you've seen it happen over the years, I'm sure. And it's good to have people from all races come around the table, all ethnicities and all ages, and say, we're more alike than we are different. Let's find our common humanity and our commonalities, and let's make this a better place for our children. I think that speaks to me the most when I've helped you guys share this story, that it really is
Yeah.
about the children, right? I mean, if we can't stand up for our children, why are we here? Do you guys agree? Your thoughts on if we focus on children, how that might bring us together?
Absolutely. I had a participant a couple weeks ago who talked about how phenomenal the space was being in the workshop space. And he said it was a productive, uncomfortable conversation that needed to happen. And
Wow.
that it was uncomfortable in that it's not something that he normally gets to engage in, but it was very productive but productive on behalf of children. So when we get into that piece where people say it's uncomfortable because we're taught not to talk about race, religion, and politics, which in and of itself is problematic. But when we do have those conversations, we, like Cindy said, we have more in common than we do different. And we can get to understanding that, oh, when I see people's shoulders do this, all I have to do is say, and the children, and you see people go right back down.
And to
Wow.
follow up on what Jill was saying, that's exactly why I was glad when she and her team changed the title of the workshop from Undoing Racism to Interrupting Racism for Children. I believe we get people a little more relaxed from the very beginning, because I think there's this subconscious thing you do. Okay, this is about children or for children. I might be willing to hear this. I might be willing to have a conversation. So I think that works very well.
I do too. I think it speaks to so many people who love children. We all love our children. And Jill, before we close, just a quick question for you. Your why. Why did you choose to do this kind of child welfare work, and in particular in the race equity space?
Well, I don't know that I chose it as much as it chose me,
Mm.
because in the 20 years that I was working in community, primarily in Marion County, but around the state of Indiana, because children that are abused and neglected can be placed in facilities or with relatives or foster parents anywhere in the state. And I saw this happening. So I was already doing the work. I was already having to question in mediations, doctor's visits, school meetings, IEPs, because my caseload at Child Advocates was always about 160 children. So I was in the same school districts. I saw children being treated completely different. I saw families being treated completely different in mediations, very similar circumstances. And so I already was asking questions that were making people uncomfortable. But if I'm advocating for children, I needed to ask why. Why was I in this mediation a month ago with a very similar case and you treated the family completely different? My colleagues and I, we used to read reports of abuse and neglect, and you could read the description of the family and the children, and 9 out of 10 times you could tell the race before you even got to the demographic descriptions. And, so whether that was physicians, whether it was social workers, teachers, law enforcement, we were seeing and we were reading the racist descriptions of families. They're just described completely different depending on the race of the child,
Mm.
and the demographics of the family. So I've been doing the work. To be able to do it solely like this is just an opportunity for us to step back and say, hey, why do we have these inequities? Why do we have an underrepresentation of white children? Why do we have an overrepresentation of African American children? Let's talk about doing better.
Boy, I think it's so critical the work you do. I'm such a fan in everything that Child Advocates does. But Cindy, as we close, both of you guys, I'll just ask you, why should people attend the Interrupting Racism for Children workshops? I'll let you start, Cindy.
I think they should participate because it's really difficult to have a conversation. I won't say in a safe place, but in a place in which you're listened to and you're allowed to develop your point of view. And the shorthand for it is Jill calls people in for the conversation, now calls people out. And I think there's too much animosity and divisiveness about how these conversations can go. And that stops people from even trying to be in a conversation. So I think, get past that, come to the workshop. Thousands have already come from all walks of life, from every profession, from every race. So I think it's a really good thing to do for the city of Indianapolis and the state.
And you, Jill?
Children are worth it. Our community, when we think about moving into the future, if we're going to keep doing the same thing, we're going to keep getting the same results.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're not willing to say, this is a problem, let's talk about what's at the root of the problem and how we can change things for future generations.
Well, I love it. Your voice, their future. That's what Child Advocates is all about. Jill, thank you, and Cindy, for the transformational work you are doing for children. The thousands of lives you've touched over the years that you've been doing this program really is making a difference. And so many of us appreciate the work you do and walk away with wider open eyes. Thank you again. And I'll just say that Jill, Cindy, and I also talk about this Interrupting Racism for Children program on our podcast, Child Advocates Podcast. I still say ours, even as a consultant.
It is ours.
Your voice, their future. We have some really deep and intricate conversations about it. You can also find that podcast on the All Indiana Podcast Network on Wish TV. So please listen, join our conversations. We're doing critical work, but we can't do it alone. We need you guys to join us too. Thank you, Jill and Cindy. Always honored to work with you.